Well, now that we've covered these last kings of Israel and the nation's fall, I want to spend the rest of our time tonight. I don't want to go back to Judah just yet because I think there's some additional information that I want to share with you about this nation of Assyria and some of the things that happened with these people after they went into Assyrian captivity. The rise of Assyria. You know, we read about Assyria a lot in the Old Testament. And the reason for that is because Assyria was around for a long, long time. But it wasn't always a strong nation. We find that it had its beginning around the year 2600 BC. But it would be roughly 1,300 more years before it would become an independent kingdom. For 1,300 years, they would be subservient to other kingdoms before finally rising in power and strength enough to be able to win their independence and be free from these other nations. We find that their power over that 1,300-year period grew steadily until the point at one time in history, Assyria was probably the strongest nation on the face of this earth. But we find that beginning around 900 BC, Assyria started to grow. They weren't satisfied with the territory that they had, and so they began to go out and conquer many of the other nations that were around them. And their territory began to grow quite rapidly. But we find that their success was due to several, I guess we could use the term advantages, several things that they had had the foresight to prepare during that time while the nation was growing in strength. A few of those things were they were the very first kingdom in history to use iron weapons. Now you may wonder, why is that significant? Because up to that point, all the weapons were made out of bronze. If you've ever worked with any type of metal or read about these things, you know bronze is a very soft metal. Iron is able to be hardened. And so when someone going into battle, one with weapons of iron and another with weapons of bronze, those with the weapons of bronze were not going to stand much of a chance. But we find also that the Assyrians were the very first military unit in history to include engineers in their ranks. And the reason they did that was because they knew when they went into battle, they were going to be going up against heavily fortified cities. They were going to be going up against places with tall, thick walls and watchtowers and things of that nature. And so they wanted people who would be able to study the layout of those places and be able to develop plans of attack that would counteract the effectiveness of those things. They were the very first military unit to have individuals that would actually plan those forms of attack. Before that, it was essentially, you just try to get in any way you can. And you were essentially at the mercy of those who had the best tactical position. But also, the Assyrians had built chariots for themselves that were a lot heavier than any of the other cavalry units that were in the world in that day. Their chariots were overlaid with iron. They had much more protection built into their chariots. And so as they went into battle, they were much more suited to be effective and to have the tools that they needed. These three advantages, along with several others that we could discuss, but these are the main three, these aided them greatly in being able to go in and to conquer those nations that were around them. But now let's talk about the kingdom itself for just a little bit. I know, I think it was Betty had asked a question about where this would have been located. Of course, due to the spread by conquering other nations, it came to encompass a large area. But the initial area that was the initial core of that kingdom would have been in modern-day Iraq. But eventually, over time, by the time that kingdom began to fall, it possessed pieces of land that are now part of modern-day Iraq, Iran, Turkey, Syria, Palestine, and they even had possession as far south as Egypt. It grew into a very, very large empire. But something that you have to keep in mind with that, as they were going through these areas, they were taking the people captive. They wouldn't go in and completely annihilate the native peoples of those lands. They would carry them back to Assyria. And oftentimes what would happen is they would take those captives and they would put them together with Assyrians and then send them back into these conquered lands to reestablish society based upon Assyrian ideals. And so what eventually you came to have an intermingled mixed breed of people. You had those who came from Assyrian background, but then you also had, as I said, you had those who had been Israelite. You had those who had been Egyptian. You had a number of different nationalities there that all came under this heading that came to be known as Samaritans. Now keep that in mind. Now, although the Assyrians were very powerful, although they were in existence for over 1,000 years, we find that when they began to decline, they declined rapidly. And we find that it was in only 5 years of time from the height of their popularity and their power. 5 years later, they fell to the Babylonians. Very quickly. But you may remember from studying some of the Old Testament prophets that there were a number of prophets who were sent to Assyria. I think a lot of times we get to thinking, the prophets, they were sent just to Israel and to Judah. No, they weren't. We find a number of prophets were also sent to the Assyrians to warn them about, the wickedness that they were engaging in. For example, Isaiah, in Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 5, he refers to the Assyrians as the rod of God's anger, indicating the fact that they were going to be the ones that God was going to use to punish Israel. They were the ones that God was allowing to rise in power so that they would be able to carry out God's purpose. But then, I find very interesting that just 7 verses later, Isaiah then tells them that they also were going to face God's judgment because of their arrogance. They wouldn't accept the fact that God was the one that had allowed them to rise in power. They thought that they were doing that based upon their own strength. And so while, yes, God was still going to use them to carry out His purpose with Israel, they were not going to be allowed to stand. They were going to be destroyed as well because of their pride. Probably the most well-known of the prophets that was sent to an Assyrian city was a man by the name of Jonah. You may remember, Jonah was told to go to the city of Nineveh. Nineveh was one of the primary cities in Assyria. Well, after he tried to get away, and you know how the story goes of being swallowed by the great fish and spending 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, he realizes that, I probably need to listen to what God has to say. He goes to Nineveh, and there he begins to preach. He begins to warn the people that God's judgment is about to come against them because of their idolatry and their wickedness. Well, lo and behold, the people from the king all the way down to the poorest repent. They change. Well, Jonah wasn't too pleased with this. Remember, Assyria was their enemy. By his estimation, God didn't need to be wasting his time with Assyria. And so he goes out and he pouts for a while. And God finally convinces him of the fact that his attitude is not what it needs to be. But we find that because the Assyrians repented at the preaching of Jonah, God spared that nation for a little bit longer. Then we find many years later a prophet by the name of Nahum, that we find his writings in the Minor Prophets as well. He came once again to Nineveh, and he came pronouncing God's judgment, just as Jonah had done many years prior. Came and told them that they were going to be destroyed, had the exact same message as Jonah. But we find this time the Assyrians wouldn't listen. They wouldn't repent. And so eventually, as I mentioned earlier, they would fall to the Babylonians under the charge of King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, after the Assyrians had served God's purpose of punishing Israel, yes, they would eventually be brought down. But we find that their influence is one that would continue for many generations. For we find that at the end of that 3-year period that ultimately led to the destruction of Israel, we find Samaria, the capital city of Israel, fell to the Assyrians. Surviving Israelites were carried away into captivity and they were dispersed. They weren't allowed to stay together. Now, something I want you to keep in mind, and we'll talk about this again when we get to the fall of Judah. When they were taken to Babylon, were they dispersed or were they allowed to stay together? They stayed together. They didn't disperse them. But we find the Assyrians, when they brought the Israelites into Assyria, they scattered them out. They didn't want all of those people together. And so ultimately what happened is at that point, they began to intermingle with those other nations around them. They began to intermarry. They began to mix the religious beliefs to where they reached the point where at one time they were worshiping God, but they were also worshiping many false gods. They were worshiping the sun, the moon, and the stars. There was a time that they were even offering their children as sacrifices to a false god. We find that they were engaged in essentially any and all religious beliefs that came along. Anything that was done in the name of religion had to be okay, and so that's what they were doing. And folks, that mentality is what would continue on with those people until the time of Christ. Now, something I want you to keep in mind as well. As I said a while ago, 134 years after this point, Judah is going to fall. But Judah is going to reach the point that they are going to repent. And God is going to allow them to go back to the promised land and is going to allow them to reestablish themselves as a kingdom. Israel is never given that right. They are never allowed to go back to Samaria and try again. Now, there were some individuals, because we read in the New Testament about some individuals from those 10 tribes that had been a part of Israel who continued to be there in Jerusalem and were active in different things. Ultimately, what happened was some of those from those tribes came back and they assimilated themselves into the Jewish people. Because remember, until they went into Babylonian captivity, the people of Judah, they were never known as Jews. They took on the name Jew when they were in Babylon. And so when they came back and they established themselves as the Jews, you had some of those from the 10 tribes who initially had been in the north who came and assimilated themselves into that new society. That does not mean that they were allowed to come back in their tribal entities. They were not allowed to establish themselves with the type of authority that they had before. But we find that as a whole, the Israelites were never allowed as an entire nation to go back to the promised land. Now there were some, and this is what I really wanted to touch on, and I've talked about this a little bit in lessons before. But after the Israelites were removed from their land territory, some of them were sent back along with some of the Assyrians and some of these other captives to go in and inhabit the cities that had been cities of Israel. That land came to be known as Samaria. They took the name of the capital city of Israel and applied that to the entire territory. And from that point forward, that area was known as Samaria. Now you may remember from your studies in the New Testament that Samaria was very much so a country at the time of Christ. But Samaria was an area that Jews, for the most part, would not set foot in. And the reason for that was twofold. And I've already touched on both of these. First, because these were mixed breed people. They were no longer what they would consider their brethren because they had intermarried with these heathen nations, but also because of the idol worship that would take place. They would not go into that place. And so we are out of time, so we are going to stop. But the thing that I wanted to end with on this is these practices that started as soon as they showed up in Samaria of worshiping God along with false gods is something that became a common practice for these people that came to be known as Samaritans. And this came to taint their view, or came to taint their reputation in the eyes of their former relatives to the south, those Jews in Judea. So we're going to stop right there. Next Wednesday night, I'll still be gone in the meeting, so Mike's going to teach class. And so then the following Wednesday night, unless Mike wants to teach this subject, he's more than welcome to. But if he wants to do something different, then we will pick back up in Judah 2 Wednesday nights from now.